so much. So our speaker this morning is the inimitable Sharon Scholl. And I looked up inimitable just to make sure it was the right word, and it means one of a kind. Sharon has been a member of this church for 20 years and has served as one of our musicians and a member or chair of many of our committees. If you have been part of this congregation for even a short time, you probably couldn't avoid knowing Sharon, and we are pleased to have her with us in the pulpit this morning.
Well, greetings all. I really hope you don't have the same reaction to this talk as a friend of mine who asked me for a quick synopsis, and I wasn't more than 2 sentences in when he stopped me and said, "You really ought to retitle this talk to How to Read the Christmas Story and Ruin It for Everyone." Yeah. His advice was, look, it's literature, it's beautiful language. What you're supposed to do is turn off your brain, sit back and let it roll over you. Well, I think that's a typical strategy. I see it used here all the time. But somewhere in your relationship to this story, you surely have at least muttered to yourself, who wrote this stuff? Is there any actual history to it? And what am I supposed to do with it? Well, the answers have become publicly available only since universities, maybe 75 years ago or so, started adding religious studies departments to their curriculum. Before that, the answers to these questions were fairly well guarded by the institutions of the churches. But once you get free scholars together, biblical experts, people who know ancient languages, ancient history, archaeologists, once you get these folks together, you begin to find out things, and they are not under the control of a church, and they begin to be available to people like me. And so the answers we are getting are interesting and surprising. For example, there is no Christmas story, not one that you can go to, say, the scriptures, and it's all there. You start with the announcement to Mary that she is pregnant with the Savior, and they go right on through to, say, the flight into Egypt. It isn't anywhere. It is a composite of a few elements that were preserved in memory, a lot of literary invention, and references, many of them, to the Hebrew Scriptures, our Old Testament. It's hunt and peck to put it all together, which people have done over the centuries and not realized that there's not really that unified story anywhere. It sort of resembles a literary Easter egg hunt, but that's what we have, and it's a nice story. Who wrote it? Well, there are only 2 accounts of Jesus' birth, and they are drawn from the traditions of 2 different early Christian congregations. And they are the way that these congregations wanted to remember Jesus, wanted to have him recalled. And the writers are anonymous. The names Matthew and Luke were applied years after the documents appeared. Matthew was circulated toward the end of the 1st century, roughly 50, 60 years after Jesus' death. And the writer, it seems obvious from the vocabulary, the style of writing, the interests, etc., was a Jew who had evidently retained some real animosity to his fellow Jews who had refused to accept Jesus as the Messiah that their group had expected for centuries now. And his gospel represents Jesus as a rabbi, a teacher, who translated the Torah into an ethic of personal piety. So that's who Jesus was to these folks. And the writer that we call Luke appeared early in the 2nd century and was named. And he, from, again, the style of writing, the vocabulary, the point of view, was obviously a Greek, a writer from the Mediterranean area whose congregation viewed Jesus as a world figure who was opposed to the narrow sectarian interests of his time, which is why in Luke, Jesus and the Pharisees, grip off often because that's the way Luke understood him. And he interpreted Jesus as a divinely appointed leader that, in turn, authorized the church leadership of Luke's time. That seemed to have been an important concern there. How do we know that these people who are heading our church are telling us, what the information that is from the source? And so it became important to validate that. And the Gospel of Luke had that as one of its purposes. Well, where did the elements of the Christmas story come from? All over. There were a few preserved stories told across the generations about Jesus, oral history that goes on. And there had been 2 written sources. Both Matthew and Luke depended upon a prior gospel, that of Mark, and an even earlier collection of Jesus' sayings that has no name. It's just called the source. And they contain no birth stories, none of these sources. And Luke and Matthew changed the details, but they told different birth stories, and ones that were suitable to their themes. So both accounts contain genealogies, for instance, but Matthew's genealogy is entirely Jewish, and it ends in Abraham, the founder of the Jewish people. Now, Luke had a more diverse genealogy, which ends in Adam, the prototype man. And both, of course, became moot when the 4th gospel, that of John, was written and declared Jesus as the divine Son of God, and he attempted no genealogy. Okay, so we get these scraps of writing, one continuous story of Jesus' ministry, and oral tradition. Okay, so the next layer, the Christmas story was written in Greek with Roman readers in mind, so it had to include the features that were expected for famous men or even famous women. There had to be certain things they just expected. There had to be prophecies of the birth. So we get that beautiful Annunciation scene in Luke. There had to be cosmic signs. So we have singing angels and we have a traveling star. And sages and kings had to voice approval and sort of give their blessing to this famous person. So we have the 3 magi trooping across the desert. Those things were just sort of expected in any story or account of a famous person. Okay, layer 2. Layer 3, because of their tenuous position in Roman society, Christians found it vital to claim descent from their Jewish roots. The deal is, the Jews had worked out this kind of entente with the Romans that freed them from having to worship the Roman gods or consider the emperor as divine. And Christians really needed that too, to escape persecution. And so it was terribly important to establish firm Jewish roots to all of these things they were saying about Jesus. And so the Hebrew scriptures were literally plundered for anything that might, without justification, be applied to Jesus. One famous one is the prophet Micah had once said, and I quote, "Out of thee, Bethlehem, will come one who will rule over Judah," unquote. That was 700 years prior to Jesus' birth and had to do with a war with the Assyrians. But Jesus had to be born there. So Luke, trots the whole crew across the desert to Bethlehem with a pregnant woman, and that's the way it has to be. In order to fulfill, and this is the phrase you see constantly in the New Testament, in order to fulfill the scriptures. And it was just really important in the second century to escape Roman censure and persecution and whatnot. So that had to go in. So what do we got? We've got oral tradition, a few written sources. We have Roman expectations for what goes into the account of a famous person, and we have the necessity of linking that person with the Hebrew scriptures because of political necessity. And then all of these sources were woven together into a literary document by two really talented writers that had a continuity, it had dramatic events, and it had memorable characters. And that's what we've got when we read the Christmas story. Well, what kind of literature is it, though? Is it history? Is it biography, short story, memoir? Well, certainly not memoir. Matthew and Luke didn't know anyone who had known anyone who had known Jesus. They were just too late in the process. The only facts that had been carried through time was that Jesus had parents, and the parents' names are recorded. He had 4 brothers, all named, and 2 sisters who are not named in any of the sources of their lifetimes. He was always identified with his hometown, Nazareth. His disciples were all grown men who left their families and their livelihoods as fishermen or laborers or farmers in order to follow Jesus, who was another day laborer with a vision that was so fantastic and marvelous that it swept them all up. And we can assume that they lived no longer than their 50s because that was the typical age for the ancient world. And so we can also assume that they were illiterate because the literacy rate for ancient societies, in the best case, ran about 5%. So what do we have? We have scant lit primary sources, no history in the way we define history. There's no effort to be objective, to give different versions of events, and there are no sources outside the scriptures to offer a critique. It is biographical, but ancient versions featured speeches composed by the writer and sort of put into the mouth of the persons as being portrayed. Situations created to show what the writer thought the person he was describing might do in a given situation. And so the gospel writers assumed that anything the ancient Jewish prophets did, Jesus had to have done as well. This is interesting. It's hard to do this, but try to think as a second century person. Here's the steps in the logic. 1, our prophets were prophets because they knew the mind of God, they were able to control nature, they were able to heal, and they even raised the dead. We know this because our ancient religious source, the Torah, tells us so, and because these things are in our oral tradition that has come down century after century. So, if then those are, this is what we know. Now, here's the second step. Jesus was a prophet. We believe this, we saw this in him. Third, so Jesus had to have been able to do these things. And fourth, because that's a slight glitch, we have no actual evidence or a tradition or stories about specific situations in which Jesus exhibited this prophet dexterity, you might say. Then we will make up these specific situations because we know, A, this is what prophets do, B, Jesus was a prophet, therefore he had to have done this. That's second century logic. Okay, so here it goes. If Isaiah in our scriptures raised to life again the dead son of a widow from the village of Nain, then Jesus had to have done the same for Mary and Martha's brother Lazarus. Second century logic. And if Moses walked through the Red Sea by parting the waters, then Jesus had to walk on the Sea of Galilee. It reminds me of that wonderful song from the Broadway musical, Annie, Get Your Gun. Anything you can do, I can do better. Oh my. So this is the stuff that goes into the Christmas story. And we have very few reasonable, reliable facts about Jesus' hometown and his family, plus a collection of teaching stories that have come down, such as the lost coin, the Good Samaritan, and the prodigal son, that literary scholars look at those things and say, yes, that is definitely the product of one mind. And these were carried along because they are so interesting, so picturesque and important here. And so everything else in this, the Christmas stories included, represents the way different groups of Christians, a century after his death, interpreted Jesus and left his message and shaped it to their general culture and their specific socio-political situation. So the question comes down, what are we supposed to do with this? Well, now Luke tells us flat out. Luke addresses his version to a fellow he calls Theophilus, or lover of God, which we understand would be the average Christian. And what he said that you're supposed to do with it is, and I quote him, to confirm the things you have been taught, unquote. So it's supposed to strengthen a set of already acquired beliefs. It was sort of the second century Fox News. Well, so what are we supposed to do with it? All of this 2,000 years hence, there will be some of us are able to cherish this Christmas story as part of our personal spiritual life, perhaps a kind of literary way of saying there is a deep benevolence at the heart of reality. That's a lovely message. And very few of us may come to share my fascination with the sources and the condition of this great human document. But for the rest of you with a more casual interest, I suspect you turn off your mind, lean back, and let it roll over you. Merry Christmas.